Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome back to the lectures on various aspects of cultural studies. As you know, these lectures are being recorded under the aegis of NPTEL, or the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, which is a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, India. We are in module 2 of these lectures, and today we shall be talking about another key concept in cultural studies, that is power. This is lecture 7 in the second module entitled Key Concepts. As always, let us do a recap of what we did in the last lecture. You will recall that the last 2 lectures were devoted to a very important term in cultural studies, in contemporary cultural studies, namely representation. We devoted 2 lectures to the term, and we tried to see the various ways in which a few practitioners, critics and theorists of cultural studies have the way in which they have deliberated upon the term representation, the different shades of meaning they give to, or they have given to, the term representation. So, a quick look at what we discussed in the last 2 lectures. We looked at the definition, or we looked at the unpacking of the term representation as given by Chris Barker in the Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies, and we saw that Barker first talks about representation as a set of processes by which signifying practices appear to stand for another object or practice in the real world. And we said that or rather we noticed that this is just, according to Barker, one of the ways of looking at representation, and the more important way in which we look at representation in cultural studies is here in the second paragraph. However, for cultural studies, representation does not simply reflect, and we had on several occasions said that this faithful rendering or representing of the world is a problematic area in is considered a problematic area in cultural studies and in studies of representation in particular. We also saw that representation is about both material objects and social practices. Okay? So, we saw that representation could be about both tangible things and intangible things, and representation contributes to meaning and intelligibility, and at the same time are also constitutive of both the object and the meaning. We then also saw that as representation as power both includes and excludes meanings. Okay? So, we also talked about there being a range of meanings, or there being potential meanings that do not so to speak see the light of day. Okay? They are excluded as far as power is concerned. Okay? So, power, which is the topic of today's discussion, is deeply related to representation. Then we also saw that Danny Cavallaro uses the term misrepresentation. He says that representation, we may think that misrepresentation is the opposite of representation. However, he says misrepresentation plays a central role in the construction of personal and collective identities. And what we think we are is often a product of how culture misrepresents us and how we misrepresent ourselves. The other word that we found given in Danny Cavaliero's book is distortion, and along with distortion and misrepresentation are, he says, not secondary or accidental aspects of human experience and of human representation. So, we have to keep in mind that even as we understand representation as a process, we sometimes have to admit that most representation can also be, it could be argued that most representation is misrepresentation, even if only for the very fact that representation can never be total, representation always excludes and includes, representation is by its very nature and the fact that it is couched in language, okay, by its very nature representation is always partial. Therefore, misrepresentation and distortion are two terms that we would have to keep in mind. Another important question that came up when we were discussing representation in the last lecture is the question, does language reflect the world? And we saw that there were three theories which after Stuart Hall we call the reflective, the intentional and the constructionist theories of that are used to answer questions like these. Does language reflect the world? We found that the reflective theory is a mimetic theory, okay, or a theory that holds that yes, we can faithfully represent through language, we can represent any phenomenon, whether natural or cultural. In the case of the intentional school of thought, we found that more, the meaning resides not in the object or even per se, okay. Meaning represents in the intention of the author. Meaning represents in what the author wills or intends to tell us, okay. Since it is always given by, a message or meaning is given to us by, or a representation is given to us by a certain agent. For instance, in this case the author. Okay. So, the reflective school, again let me repeat, argues that we can faithfully represent things, okay, in a reflectionist mode, right, by claiming that whatever we are, the manner on the also the matter in which we are representing any phenomenon is something that can be said to have represented it completely and faithfully. Finally, we have the constructionist school, and if you remember, we had said that in the constructionist school of thought of representation argues that all reality, including our social realities, are constructed by human beings and hence are always and by its very nature divorced from or different from the object per se. We also said that we would then have to use the term non-ontological or non-essential in talking about the constructionist school of thought, and the constructionist school of thought is non-ontological. How? It is non-ontological in having these characteristics, that it is social, okay? It is the representation is symbolic, it is constructed and it is relational, that is, it is related to other parts or other constituents of a system. Okay. Then we also talked about the circuit of culture as given to us by Stuart Hall, and we found that though representation is a very important term in the study of culture and cultural studies, it cannot be studied in isolation, and we have to see the study of representation and of other key concepts, okay, as belonging to what Stuart Hall calls the circuit of culture. In this case, if you look at this slide, all these terms are deeply related to one another. Representation is related to the regulation of meaning, for instance, okay. Then the production of meaning through representation is related to the consumption of meaning, okay. The consumption of meaning is related to identity. and all these are related to one another. This therefore is what Stuart Hall calls very importantly the circuit of culture. It is important for us to remind ourselves that if we theorize, when we theorize in cultural studies, we cannot talk about all these concepts as discrete entities. Now, I would like to move towards rather our topic of discussion today, which is power, okay, which as we know is another key concept. And as by now most of you are aware that one of the key theorists who comes to our mind the moment we utter a word like power, particularly within the cultural studies framework, is Michel Foucault. And I would like to relate representation and power through Foucault and through Foucault and this third school of thought of representation known as constructionism. And I shall bring this to you through Stuart Hall. Now, let us first read what Hall has to say about the relation between Foucault and constructionism and representation. This idea that physical things and actions exist, but they only take on meaning and become objects of knowledge within discourse is at the heart of the constructionist theory of meaning and representation. Let us look at this again. The idea that things and actions actually exist, but they take on meaning and they become objects of knowledge at the things that you can study, okay, as a cultural specimen for instance. They only take on meaning and become objects of knowledge within discourse. This is at the heart of the constructionist theory of meaning and representation. Foucault argues that since we can only have a knowledge of things if they have a meaning, it is discourse and not the things in themselves which produces knowledge. This is very important. Okay? This is Foucault repeating what the constructionist school of thought would say. Okay? Since we can have a knowledge, we can only have a knowledge of things through what? Through discourse. And essentially what does it mean to say through discourse, that we have knowledge of something through discourse? It means in the first place that the knowledge of something is derived through language. Therefore, he argues that we then have knowledge of something not from what he calls the things in themselves. The things in themselves are only the reflectionist school of thought would say that meaning resides in the object, okay, and not in language or not in social construction. Okay. But as a constructionist, Foucault would argue like this, that things in themselves do not produce knowledge. What produces knowledge? Knowledge is produced by the fact that it is represented to us through discourse. Further, subjects like madness, punishment and sexuality only exist meaningfully within the discourses about them. Okay, let us look at this again. Madness, sexuality, punishment, etc. These are again key areas of study in Foucault's oeuvre, and he says that these subjects, like if you study madness, if you study punishment, if you study sexuality, okay, these subjects will exist meaningfully only within a certain discourse, okay, the discourse that represents it. And these further, these discourses will also vary from time to time. Okay. These discourses will have what Foucault would call their own epistemes, okay, or their own knowledge units in different ways in different periods of time. Okay. So, we will move into power, but before that we need to understand, okay, that Foucault is also in this sense he appeals to the constructionist school of thought as far as representation is concerned. Okay. We will first look at what we call the commonsensical meaning of the term power, or the dictionary meaning of the term power. Now, let us look at this slide. There are various ways in which power is defined, okay, and the Oxford English Dictionary gives us some of these meanings. First, power may be considered generally an ability or capacity, in that you have the ability, you have the power to do something, you have the ability to do something, you have the capacity to do something, okay, something that is in you and you will be able to do it, in the sense that we say that I have the power, okay, to complete this particular job. Secondly, power is the, please look at the slide, ability to act or affect something strongly. So, power is not in just the meaning of power, it's not simply in the general sense of the capacity to do something, okay. It is also the ability to act or affect something strongly. Physical or mental strength might mean, please look at the slide, physical or mental strength, might, vigor, energy, effectiveness. Or number 3, power could also refer to the political power of a nation or the national strength. If you say that country X is a powerful nation, in that sense power refers to political strength or the strength of a nation. It could be economic strength of the nation or military strength of the nation, etc. Number 4, power is also the control or authority over ours. If you say that he or she has the power, okay, he or she has the power to take this action, to carry out this action, or he or she has the power to decide, decide certain things. So, in that sense is the point number 4 talks about that, that sense of the meaning of the term power. So, control or authority over others, dominion, rule, government, command or sway, sense of having power over a certain territory. Okay. Next, power is also understood as the capacity to direct or influence the behavior of others, personal or social influence. And last but not the least, power is legal ability, the capacity or authority to act. Power is delegated authority. Particular authorities are, they are delegated certain powers. For instance, a head of an institution, okay, has certain powers delegated to him or her. The head of a nation has certain powers delegated to him or her. In that sense, power is a legal ability, capacity or authority to act, delegated authority, authorization, commission, legal authority vested in a person or persons in a particular capacity. Now, when we look at all these the various ways in which the Oxford English Dictionary articulates the meaning, various meanings of power, okay, we will now look at how power is further defined and understood and articulated within the cultural studies framework. If you look at this slide, this is something that we had, I think, talked about, if not the first, at least in the second lecture, okay. And we had said that culture, when we use the word culture, we use it in a way, the scope of culture entails the following. Culture is a language, culture refers to artifacts, tools, culture is importantly a way of life, and in that, if you remember, we had included power. So, the recognition of power as a key concept and an important component, okay, of cultural studies was discussed by us way back in module 1 in either the first or second lecture. Okay. This is just to show you, to reiterate the fact that power is an important component of culture. Now, let's read this. Cultural studies is different from other disciplines in its strong emphasis in the political. This is also was a point that we had recognized early on in this series of lectures, and we said that why do cultural studies? For instance, we have the anthropological way of looking at culture, the anthropological way of studying culture, and remember Barker's book on cultural studies, which I said we could use as a textbook, okay, quite clearly moves away from what is called by some the old emphasis on doing cultural studies, the old way of doing cultural studies, okay, in the sense as he does not look at culture simply as a way of life. In the or for instance, why have an area of study known as cultural studies if the linguistic once we if it is a fact that the linguistic turn itself is enough for us to understand that things are always represented in discourse, through language. Okay. So, on the one hand you have anthropology, on the other hand you have the linguistic turn in linguistics. So, why have cultural studies? If we were to really zoom in on that element in cultural studies, which makes it different from the way we study culture in anthropology, or the way we look at representation in in the humanities after the linguistic turn, then we would have to zoom in on this element. Okay? Please look at the slide again. Cultural studies is different from other disciplines in its strong emphasis on the political. This is a clear way of saying that the study of power is an integral part, okay? It is an indispensable part of cultural studies. It has a constant goal, and that is even when you do cultural studies in various ways, okay, you are not to lose sight of a goal which he says is a constant goal. It has a constant goal, and what is the goal of cultural studies that we ought not to forget? The goal is this, and please look here, the uncovering of the relationship between culture and power. Okay. So, culture and power, this is what gives rise to politics. Obviously, in a very, I am putting this in a simple way, but the nexus, so to speak, okay, the nexus, so to speak, between culture and power is something that we ought not to lose sight of. So, we will quickly look at two quotations draw attention towards the relationship between the relation between representation and power. The first is by Larry Gross, and this is what he has to say. Representation in the mediated reality of our mass culture is in itself power. Okay. So, in this, what is happening here in this quotation, we are not simply connecting representation with power. We are in fact saying through Larry Gross that representation in itself, okay, is culture, or sorry, is power, and is to be considered as power. Look at this again. Representation, as long as we understand reality to be mediated, okay, particularly in mass culture, is in itself power. Okay. So, representation equals power. Second, by Stuart Hall, representation functions more like the model of a dialogue. What sustains this dialogue is the presence of shared cultural codes which cannot guarantee that meanings will remain stable forever, though attempting to fix meanings is exactly why power intervenes in discourse. Okay. So, let us break it up. Representation functions, okay, like a dialogue, right, and this dialogue is possible because of the presence of shared cultural codes, right. So far so good. However, this cannot guarantee that meanings will remain stable forever. That is, one, we had I think talked about this in the last lecture or in the lecture before this, where we had said that culture is all about shared cultural codes, but one important fact that we need to remember is that cultural codes may be shared by a certain community or a certain culture, but across cultures, okay, there is always a problem of decoding the cultural codes, because the encoding is done within a particular culture. In that sense, what we find here is that even if we have shared cultural codes, when that cannot also guarantee that meanings will remain stable forever. Okay. And what is this force, or what is this force that tries to stabilize meaning? The force, the cultural force that tries to stabilize meaning, okay, is called power by Stuart Hall. Power intervenes in the discourse and seeks to stabilize meaning. Therefore, if we look at it graphically, representation, okay, is related to power, right? Representation is done through dialogue, and it is about meaning, or the achieving of meaning, so to speak, or the production and the consumption of meaning through cultural codes or shared cultural codes. Further, we will look at some of the formulations by Chris Barker. Now, let us look at this. Cultural studies is an interdisciplinary field in which perspectives from different disciplines can be selectively drawn on to examine the relations of culture and power. Here again, Barker is articulating the main goal of cultural studies. Okay. So, the interdisciplinary, we remember we talked about the sheer interdisciplinary scope of cultural studies in our first lecture, and that some by its very nature of being interdisciplinary, we would have to select, right, we would have to select certain discourses or certain formulations from sociology, from philosophy, from language, from even consciousness studies, etc. Okay. And why are we bringing all of these together? In our bid to understand or examine, as it says, to examine the relations of culture and power. Second, he says, the forms of power that cultural studies explores. Okay. Now, power has to come in certain forms. Power is, may be ubiquitous, it may be ever present or omnipresent, or there everywhere in every aspect of culture, but power needs to take on certain forms in order to be effective. So, let us read again. The forms of power that cultural studies explores are diverse and include, what are these forms of power? Gender, race, class, colonialism, etc. These are the forms of power, or these are both the forms of power and the frameworks through which power operates. Cultural studies seeks to explore the connections between these forms of power and develop ways of thinking about power and culture that can be utilized by agents in the pursuit of change. So, our first excuse me, our first job is to draw on interdisciplinary areas and to examine the relations of culture and power. Do we leave it only at that? No. Okay. Why are we doing this exercise in the first place? Why are we looking at different forms of power like colonialism, like gender, like race, etc., trying to also understand the interrelations among these different forms of culture, okay, how they help each other, okay, how they further power. The need to do this is a political one, okay, and it is this. Let us look at this again. That can be utilized by agents in the pursuit of change. Okay. The pursuit of change is again a cornerstone of cultural studies. Let us also look at how another critic, okay, David Oswell, in his book Culture and Society, okay, let us look at the questions he raises about power. Let us look at some of the formulations he gives us on power. For instance, question number 1, how are the actions of one influenced by another? Okay, how are the actions that we perform, right? How are our actions influenced by others, and how do we influence others by our actions? Point number 2, power is the capacity to act on the actions of others. Sorry, he defines power as our capacity. Remember, one of the definitions of power was as capacity, as ability, the first definition given by the Oxford English Dictionary, in the general sense, okay, almost a generic definition of power as ability and capacity. So, David Oswell furthers this by saying that power is the capacity to do what? It is a capacity to act on the actions of others. He also, point number 3, he also, let us look at this slide here, he also he also agrees with other critics, okay, by saying that the question of the relation between power and culture is highly significant. And he also raises another question: is cultural power a determinant of other kinds of power like economic and political power? Remember, the Oxford English Dictionary also talks about political power or national strength, the power of a nation, okay, which is usually understood in terms, in military terms or in economic terms. But he says, could we also talk about cultural power being a determinant of other kinds of power like economic and political power. So, we see that different critics have have agreed on this point, that the negotiation or the relation between culture and power is something that is central to cultural studies and needs to be investigated. Oswald further says, the power of words and ideas, of stories and imagination, of passion and experience in the building of worlds that include some but exclude others. Now, this resonates with so many other critics. It resonates with what Stuart Hall, some of the quotations we saw from Stuart Hall, some of the formulations we found from Chris Barker, from Danny Cavallaro. Okay. So, this is just to show you that most of the critics agree, okay, on points like this. Okay. Worlds, look at this please, worlds that include some but exclude others, that congratulate some but disparage others, and that allow some to accumulate great symbolic, cultural and economic wealth, and for others to have very little. Now, this happens, as they would argue, as these theorists would argue, through the agency of power. We also, again quickly let us go recall some of the things we talked about in Marxism, and this quotation, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, that is, the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal, consequently, this is what is important for us from the point of view of power, of cultural power, consequently also controls the means of mental production, so that the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are on the whole subject to it. Now, this on the whole subject to it simply means that it is the power of the mental ideas, okay, of the ruling class are those that are usually imbibed by those who lack the means of mental production. Further, the ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relations. The dominant material relations grasped as ideas, hence of the relations which make the one class the ruling one, therefore, the ideas of its dominance. What is happening here is, this is a clear articulation of how ideas, okay, how ideas can give power to a certain class within the, if you articulate it within the Marxist framework. Okay. Ideas are in this sense also power. Now, we look at Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno and the way they have talked about power through technological rationality, okay? And we again read from them. The basis on which technology is gaining power over society is the power of those whose economic position in society is strongest. Okay? Just before this, in the quotation from from Karl Marx, from Marxism, we talked about ideas. Just go back to this. We talked about ideas equaling power. We talked about the ruling ideas are always the ideas of the ruling class. The same way here, Horkheimer and Adorno relate technology. Okay, relate technology to power and to the power of those whose economic position is strongest. Let us read this again. The basis on which technology is gaining power over society is the power of those whose economic position in society is strongest. Technical rationality today is the rationality of domination. The important point here to relate is the rationality of technology, okay, is today the rationality of domination. It is the compulsive, I will quickly finish, complete this quotation. It is the compulsive character of a society alienated from itself. Automobiles, bombs and films hold the totality together until their leveling element demonstrates its power against the very system of injustice it served. For the present, the technology of the culture industry confines itself to standardization and mass production and sacrifices what once distinguished the logic of the work from that of society. This we can look at it from through this representation. Technological rationality is the rationality of domination, and hence technological rationality is something that gives power to the economically strongest class in society. The culture industry, which is also dependent on technology, ensures standardization and mass production. Maybe just a while ago talked about when you looked at the quotation from Larry Gross, we talked about representation, as he says representation is power. As when we look at mass consumption and mass production, mass media, representation is equal to power. Again, let us look at what Stuart Hall has to say. Culture is a critical site of social action and intervention, where power relations are both established and potentially unsettled. If we think that it is always a one way, it's a one way matter, that we think that if we think that power relations are always established, that the dominant class always has power, we would be then completely missing out on a wholly on a part of this whole study of power in cultural studies, which is equally important, and that is the unsettling of power. We, like Foucault, we have to understand that power is not just disabling, power can also be enabling, right. Power is sought to be established. Even as power is sought to be established, power is also potentially unsettled. So, it again by Stuart Hall, it works primarily by inserting the subordinate class into the key institutions and structures which support the power and social authority of the dominant order. Now, the point is, like we discussed just a while ago, that we discussed about the forms of power. If you remember, when we looked at the articulation by I think it was Chris Barker, he said that there are power operates to certain forms, and what were those forms? If you recall, those forms are forms of gender, forms like gender, race, colonialism, etc. Now, these are the structures and these are the institutions through which power operates, through which cultural studies recognizes that power operates through certain institutions, which are also the forms that were talked about by Barker. It is above all in these structures and relations that a subordinate class lives out its subordination. So, we need certain socio-cultural structures, certain forms and relations for this very subordination to be worked out. In the same way, we have to also remind ourselves that it is also within the framework, within the work, within the forms and institutions and practices in which subordination is lived out. From these forms, these very forms, this second aspect of power comes upon. That is, it is something that is always potentially sought to be unsettled, and which is from time to time also being achieved. That is the unsettling of power. Therefore, if you look at the slide, power works through institutions. Power works through institutions. Power works through structures to give rise to certain relations among people, and these relations, these institutions and structures, they see to it, or rather this is through which power operates, and this is through which the subordination of subordinate classes is achieved. We look next at formulations by Michel Foucault. Power relations are rooted deep in the social nexus, not reconstituted above society as a supplementary structure. We use prepositions like over to have power over somebody, okay, to exercise power on something, right. Now, these prepositions may lead us to think that power is something that is always clamped from the outside, or something that is always clamped from above. Look at how Foucault articulates it. Power relations are rooted deep in the social nexus, not reconstituted above society as a supplementary structure whose radical effacement one could perhaps dream of. Power is not something that is acquired, seized or shared, something that one holds on to or allows to slip by. Some of the so called commonsensical definitions of power may lead us to think that power is something, it's an either or situation, either you have power or you do not. It's like when somebody holds a certain office, okay, we think that this person has power, okay, it's something that one is clinging on to. The moment the day he retires or is relieved of his office, of that particular office or job or responsibility, we think that power has slipped out, right. We use words, terms like this, power has slipped out of his hands or he has relinquished power. This kind of discourse, this kind of way of talking about power may mislead us, Foucault says, into thinking that power, as he says here, that power is something acquired, seized, okay, or shared, something that we hold on to or something that we allow to slip away. Power is exercised from this is very important, from innumerable points. Okay. Power operates operates through innumerable nodes. Okay. These nodes are different forms, these are different structures, these are different institutions in society. Okay. In the interplay of non-egalitarian and mobile relations. The point from this slide that we need to note is therefore A, power is not something that is imposed from the outside that words like or prepositions like over and on may lead us into believing. Okay. Second, power is not, it's not a case that you either have power or you don't have power. Okay. Power operates through in a more horizontal sort of a way, okay, through what Foucault calls innumerable points in society and in discourse. Therefore, power relations are, what is the job of the cultural theorists? The job of the cultural theorists is the analysis, first to look at power relations and to analyze these power relations. What are the institutions from which these power relations are emanating? Okay. How many of these forms of power, right, are working together to be so ubiquitous, to be so totally present, okay, to be spread so horizontally, right. For instance, when you look at these institutions and structures or forms of power, for instance, again we can ask questions like this: the forms of power like gender, race, colonialism and even caste, right, are they working in tandem in a certain sociocultural scenario? So, such analyses would have to be made by cultural studies. And secondly, there is elaboration. Okay, we also need to elaborate how these power relations are taking place. After how we need to further describe these and work out the analysis. Hence, there has to be a questioning. There has to be a questioning of the order, right, in our bid to understand the working of power, in our bid to understand that power is not clamped from the outside, that power is part and parcel of the very lives that we lead. And this is the political task inherent in doing cultural studies. So, when you study cultural studies, you are not really studying it as a subject that you take for an exam or to study to write an exam or to get a degree. Okay. Some amount of commitment, political commitment is expected when you are a serious scholar of cultural studies. Now, I will look at what Claire O'Farrell has to, the way an exposition on Foucault has been done. Okay. O'Farrell says that Foucault argues a number of points in relation to power and offers definitions that are directly opposed to more traditional liberal and Marxist theories of power. This is an important point. Okay. If we looked at formulations given by Marxism or maybe other even liberal schools of thought on how ideas, okay, how ruling ideas, for instance, are the ideas of the ruling class, and they are tied so much to economics and to ideology, okay, to the base, to the modes of production. Then what is the need to talk about power a little differently? So, why do we need to listen to what Foucault has to say? Claire O'Farrell says here that in the Foucauldian, in the Foucauldian discourse on power, there are certain points that we have to remember very carefully. Now, please look at the slide. A, power is not a thing, but a relation. Okay, it's very important. It is not a thing that you look for. You try and understand, expound on power. You try to look at the presence of power and the workings of power in terms of relations. Okay. It is not a thing, but a relation. Power is not simply repressive, but it is productive. We all this while, been more or less talking about power being repressive. Power is also productive, and this very productivity of power is again proof or testimony to the fact that power is so ubiquitous and power is found everywhere. Power next is not simply a property of the state. Power is not something that is exclusively localized in government and the state. Rather, power is exercised through the social body. This again brings to us to the to this point that we had discussed, that power is not something clamped from outside. Next, power operates at the most micro levels of social relations, and power is omnipresent at every level of the social body, not just the economic or not just the commercial. Okay. The exercise of power is strategic and warlike. Okay. That there's power has institutions, forms and structures have certain strategies through which they see to it that power is always present, right. So, let us move on to the discussion, and we will take just a few questions because we do not have much time here. For instance, let us look at a question like, why is power an important concept in cultural studies? The answer is culture and power are both tied to politics. There is in a way politics only because power is such a part of culture, and cultural studies is different from other disciplines and in its strong emphasis on the uncovering of the relationship between culture and power. Its constant goal is to show how culture and power are related and how power operates in culture and in society, and that is why it is so important as a part of cultural studies. Second, how are representation and power related, both being very important concepts in cultural studies? The answer is this. In the sense that Larry Gross articulates it, representation is power. Okay? In the reality, the mediated reality of mass culture, representation becomes power. Right? There is the power of certain ideas to hold, certain images to hold, okay, our imagination for a very long time, and even, so to speak, to determine our ways of living, our values, our conducts even. And secondly, in the way articulated by Stuart Hall, representation functions more like the model of a dialogue which sustains, and what sustains this dialogue is the presence of shared cultural codes, and through attempting, though we attempt to fix meanings, okay, it is exactly why power intervenes in discourse. So, representation is seen by Hall, okay, through the model of a discourse, okay, and power intervenes in discourse, and this is another way in which power and representation are related. The next question is, how do Adorno and Horkheimer relate technology and the culture industry to power? We had looked at this, and how would you answer this? You would say that according to Horkheimer and Adorno, the basis on which technology is gaining power over society is the power of those whose economic position in society is the strongest, but you would focus more on this. Technical rationality today is the rationality of domination, the rationality of that is offered to us by technology. Okay, the representation of the world through technology is actually which is seen as rationality, is actually a rationality of power and the rationality of domination. How does or show how Stuart Hall relates power to culture? Stuart Hall says that culture is a critical site where power relations are both established and potentially unsettled. Therefore, if power has to work, it needs a site, and that site is culture. That is how he relates culture and power. Second, power works primarily by inserting the subordinate class into key institutions and structures. Now, these key institutions and structures are what culture is comprised of. Okay? So, for power to work, power has to work primarily if power has to subordinate. If you look at the subordinating the dominating aspect of power, then we have to understand through Stuart Hall that power needs certain, as I have said in so many times in this lecture, power needs certain forms, power needs certain institutions, and power needs certain structures for it to be able to dominate and to subordinate. And these institutions and powers are what we call culture. Mention two Foucauldian, this is the final question, mention two Foucauldian formulations of power, on power, and this is what Michel, two of the many formulations are what we are going to look at. Power relations are rooted deep in the social nexus, not reconstituted above society. So, power is not a supplementary structure, power is not something that is clamped from above or something that is outside. Okay, of the very site on which it operates, right. Second formulation is power is not something that you acquire or hold on to or something that you seize. Like we have always had these ways of talking about power, like power was seized from the government, there was a military coup or there was an annexation and power was seized. Okay. We have been used to these sort of these ways of talking about power, but Foucault says that power is not something in cultural studies. When you look at culture and power, power is not something that you acquire. Okay, it's not something that was never with you. So, power is something that has always been with you, even if you have been part of the subordinate class. Why? Because there is always the potential, and in this sense another meaning of the word power, there is also the potential power in you to unsettle the established order. So, power is not something that is acquired, seized or shared, something that one holds to or allows to slip away. Power is exercised from innumerable points in the interplay of non-egalitarian and mobile relations. Okay. So, power there are many nodes, power, as it says, innumerable points in the whole fabric of our culture and society through which power operates. When I consider what we have talked about today, as far as power is concerned, like in the case of so many other concepts that we have talked about, I am also this time left with the feeling that we have barely scratched the surface of this very important term. Okay, there are, as I said, so many, even from Foucault, for instance, we have his concept of bio power, his concepts of dispositive or the apparatus of power. Okay, we have the idea of his concepts of governmentality. There are many ways, and those of you who are interested to look at this part, okay, or to look at the formulations of power as given to us particularly by Michel Foucault, could go on to read his works like Power, Knowledge, the History of Sexuality, to look at his works like Discipline and Punish, for instance, okay, to see. There is also the idea of the panopticon. You could very well go on and look, look at those titles. As far as this lecture was concerned, my attempt was to bring to you certain, to show you certain ways in which the dictionary, the dictionary definitions of power are not do not suffice when we look at power from a cultural studies points of view, and I have tried to bring in a few critics and their formulations on power, and as always it is just the unpacking has just begun. Okay. We will stop here today, and we have just a couple of lectures in in this module on gender, for instance, and then after that we shall be moving on to another module which is entitled the sites of culture studies. Okay. Thank you.